and is one of the few books that addresses the engineers and the managers and the business people through adopting open source in confidence. Heather is a former Unix software engineer and a former lecturer at Berkeley and a very successful lawyer with expertise also on open source. After the keynote, Heather will be with us in room Cypress A for an interactive session on open source compliance. And please, managers from our member companies, do join and ask questions. So please welcome Heather Meeker.
Thank you very much. It was a very interesting talk about where we're going from a technology point of view. Today I'm going to talk a little bit about where we're going from a legal point of view in open source. You know, I'm a lawyer in private practice, as you heard, and so I'm basically a tactician, helping my clients accomplish their business goals. And so, but I do like to think about some of the bigger issues that are facing open source software licensing. And this talk is about one of the issues I've been thinking about. You'll note that the title is different from on the schedule. That's because I took the liberty of updating it to what I am thinking about just at this moment. So I'd like to talk to you about a legal issue that is in the works in open source licensing, in the hopes that it'll be as interesting to you as it is to me. And because this makes some allusions to it, and if you haven't seen the movie, I apologize, and your friends around you can explain the metaphor, perhaps. Okay, so open source as a family business. Now, these statistics are kind of nonsense, but they show a trend that I think we all understand, which is that way back in the day, you know, we're talking about in the 1990s maybe, open source was mostly the purview of hobbyists, and today it's mostly the purview of quote-unquote professionals, corporations, and so forth. So the types of participation have really changed over the years. It really started as a kind of a family business, and now it's morphed into something slightly different. But some of the family business aspects of it are still with us and are likely to cause a legal concern going into the future. I don't know how many of you might have been involved in an actual family business. I have myself, and I can tell you that there's a kind of a unicorns and roses version of the family business where some, you know, enthusiastic entrepreneurs open up a business that they really love, and they work at it all their lives, and they're very successful, and then they bequeath it to their children who go on to do great things with the family business. In reality, that's not usually the way it works. Most family businesses don't survive one generation, and very few survive 2 or 3. So the dream is the picture that's on your right, and the reality is sometimes a picture on your left. And for those of you who it's a little bit dark, you can't see it. That's Fredo in The Godfather. Okay, so Fredo was the son who was just really incapable of doing anything right. And one of the issues in The Godfather was what happened when the business, this organized crime business, was bequeathed to the next generation and basically fell apart. So we have the dream, which is the wonderful family business, and then we have the reality, which sometimes is Fredo. So I'm going to have to explain this issue, I have to explain a few things about some legal principles of open source licensing, and I promise you it won't be painful, or at least not very painful, no more painful than your flu shot. These are important things to understand. If you're participating in open source development, you or your company are dealing with a system for granting and sharing of rights, and these are some of the basic principles that underlie how it works. From a legal point of view, for lawyers like me who are business lawyers, open source is a very different kind of paradigm from sort of proprietary software, really a sea change kind of difference. And And so these things that I'm going to explain to you really are uniquely related to open source software licensing. Okay, so first of all, the conditional licensing model. So all open source licenses work like this. And from a technical, legal, structural point of view, this is very unusual. There's really almost nothing else that works this way. So what open source licenses say are, here's a software, do anything you want with it, but if you distribute, then you're going to have to do something for me in exchange. Well, it looks like I lost a picture there. Sorry. That was a picture of a baton pass in a long-distance race. So that would be distribution. So if you distribute the software, you must do something. And what you must do is share your source code with those people that you gave binary code to. And if you fail to do that, which represents which the red squiggly line represents, then there's a consequence, and that consequence is that you're a copyright infringer. Okay, so that may sound straightforward, but it's actually a very nuanced kind of paradigm that's really important to understand. One of the consequences of this is that if you fail to follow the requirements of an open source license, what happens is you get sued for intellectual property infringement. And I'm sure some of you have heard of that before, and you may have wondered why that's so, because the licenses look kind of like contracts. You may have heard that people say they're not contracts. And one of the reasons people say that, which, by the way, is kind of true and kind of not true, well, the comment you would expect from a lawyer, of course, is that it was set up that way purposely for a reason which is causing the very issue that I'm going to describe. So what that means is that if you contribute to an open source project and somebody violates your rights, you have the right to sue them for copyright infringement. Another principle to understand is that the person who has the right to sue for copyright infringement is the owner of the copyright, or an exclusive licensee, but that's not relevant in open source licensing. So if you are the owner of a copyright, either because you authored it or because you have sold it to someone else who then owns it, then the person who owns it is the one who has the right to bring the lawsuit. And for brevity, I'm going to refer to the person who owns the copyright as the author, although it can get passed from one person to another. A non-exclusive licensee can't enforce. So the possibilities when you get intellectual property from somebody is you own it, or you got an assignment of rights to it, or you're a non-exclusive licensee, which means you can practice it, but that's it. That's the only right you have. Non-exclusive licensees have no standing in court because they don't get the right to exclude everyone. The basis of value of intellectual property is the ability to exclude others. So in proprietary world, that means if somebody violates your license, you can go sue them and make them pay you money and so forth. In open source, it's kind of the same way. If someone violates your rights, you can sue them for copyright infringement. And that's just the way that the enforcement model works. And here's the key on open source licensing. It's what we call a direct licensing model. So this is a complicated little picture, but if you have an open source code base, there are a lot of copyrights involved there. Everyone who contributes retains their own copyright, and then the project, whoever that might be, has an additional copyright interest, which I would call like one for the pot. You know, when you make, the traditional idea is when you make a pot of tea, it's a spoon of tea for each person and one for the pot. Well, it's similar kind of situation in open source software licensing, where a single code base can have 1 or 100 or even 1,000 copyrights associated with it, and then whoever it is that put the whole thing together has a copyright consisting of the putting together the entire thing, and it's sometimes called a compilation copyright. The person who has the compilation copyright is, if it's an entity of some kind that is running the project, then that entity would have the right. If there's no entity, then it's an open question. But the point is that all those little copyright symbols represent many, many copyrights that are being licensed simultaneously, side by side, to the eager programmer in the lower right-hand corner. And that's how it works. All of these rights are being licensed simultaneously, side by side. There's not just one license. There is, in fact, many. They're just usually all licensed under the same terms. And this is very important, particularly for a project like the Linux kernel, which is, of course, everybody's favorite open source project, because there are thousands of contributors to the open source, to the Linux kernel, and all of those copyrights get licensed directly to all recipients. So that little guy programming in the corner is enjoying a license from many, many authors. Okay. So those are the legal principles. I hope those weren't too painful. And now we're going to talk about an issue that you might have heard of, which is a bit of a political issue in the open source world over the last, say, 5 years mostly. And that is, should projects use contribution licenses, or should the license in equal the license out? This is an issue on which, well, maybe not surprisingly in open source world, there's a lot of flame wars on discussion groups about this. For instance, there are basically two models for managing the rights in an open source project. One is to use what's called a contribution license, and that's the model that's used by the Apache Foundation and many other projects who happen to use the Apache Foundation contribution license because they like the license. But the point of that is that what the authors do is they grant rights to the project, to whoever's running the project, and also to all the recipients, and then the project has, passes on certain rights to the recipient. The bottom line for that is that the project can then change the outbound licensing of the entire project, and some developers object to that. And so it is more popular in the open source community to do license in equals license out. So in license in equals license out, everybody just throws their rights into the pot and they go directly to the recipient, but the project doesn't have any greater rights. And you might have heard of the DCO, which is what the Linux kernel uses. That's a document that just says it's your original work and it doesn't really pass on any rights at all. If you are a contributor to a GPL project like the kernel, you are saying to the entire world, I contributed this thing, everybody gets it directly from me under GPL. They might be simultaneously getting a bunch of other grants from other contributors, but they get it directly. And what I would like to point out about both these models is that they essentially work in the same way with respect to this larger issue. Everybody who is a recipient gets a license directly from the author. So that's the way open source licensing works. And the project itself may have no standing to sue at all unless it can figure out some rights that it actually has on an exclusive basis. Okay, so now we have to turn to a sensitive topic, and that is what happens when the first generation of open source developers starts to move to the big bit bucket in the sky. You know, open source has been around for a while now, and a great deal about the running of open source projects and enforcement of open source licenses has been done on a community basis, and that's as it should be. But the first generation of programmers will not be with us forever. And we've got a potential, I don't necessarily want to call it a crisis, but we've got an issue, something to think about what happens when the first generation of authors starts to leave us. Now, I'm talking about the individual contributors. Corporations never die, in a sense, and so if they have granted rights to a project, those basically stay forever, and that's kind of one of the points of having a corporation. But an individual who passes on will, the rights that that individual owns will be owned by that individual's personal heirs. So the right is inheritable, and copyright law is written specifically to enable this. The term of copyright in the United States is life plus 70, meaning if you're a real individual natural person, as we say in the law, a natural person, and you own a copyright, when you die, your heirs get the right for 70 years. It was specifically set up so that the children of artists wouldn't starve, right? And it's been expanded and expanded over the years, so the right is definitely inheritable, and it lasts a long time after the original author's death. Okay, so here's the problem. You've got potentially thousands of Fredos who have the right to sue people for copyright infringement. So how does this work in the real world? Well, currently, there has been relatively little rogue enforcement, in the sense that an individual author would look at someone who has violated an open source license and just sue them for copyright infringement. Most of the enforcement done in open source world is currently done on a community basis. But one of the reasons for that is that the people who own the rights are involved in the community. If you have a situation where the individual authors have passed on, those rights will then be owned by the heirs of that author, which would usually be their children or some family member who may have little or no interest in the open source community. Accordingly, there's an expectation among lawyers in the field that rogue enforcement may increase dramatically over the next few decades. To date, we've had, as I say, relatively few rogue enforcers. There's one who's rather notorious, but unfortunately most of the information about it is confidential. If you are curious about that, you can email me and I'll send you an article you can read about it. But that's not the point. The point is that relatively little of it has happened so far because most of the rights holders are part of the community. The issue here is that once they pass on, their heirs may not be part of the community. They may not care about the community. They may actually dislike the community. And so then you potentially have every user of a big open source project vulnerable to, at least theoretically, thousands of lawsuits at the same time, which is a problem for the user, but it will also be a problem for open source because if people start to get scared of lawsuits, they will be reluctant to use open source anymore. I mean, we saw that in the 90s and up to the early 2000s. There's a lot of trepidation about open source software licenses and what they meant and how enforceable they were and what were the community norms and what did GPL mean and so forth. And since that time, the legal landscape has calmed down a lot, and people are less fearful, companies are less fearful about being sued for copyright infringement because community enforcement has worked, reasonably well, or it's been reasonably cohesive. But now we're looking, just because of the natural progress of the generations, at a situation where enforcement might become extremely fragmented and might be conducted by people with no interest in benefiting the open source community. So far, this has kind of worked. Like in The Godfather, Michael says, don't ever take sides against the family. And then Fredo betrays him and he says, I knew it was you and you broke my heart. I mean, that's kind of what's happening in the community these days, in the sense that people in the community are trying to enlist authors in community enforcement and participating in community enforcement. And as I said, it's worked okay so far, but it's not going to work forever, particularly when the rights pass on. So we've still got the Fredo problem in the works. So it's fair to ask then, what is the solution to this problem? And I have to be candid to you, I don't have a solution to the problem. The problem has to be solved on a community basis. And there are people who are thinking about this and concerned about this, but I would say that there's no one obvious scheme, or scheme is the wrong word because that has a negative connotation, but a model to address this. But it needs to be addressed within the next couple of decades, or else there are potentially some real issues. If you have a whole bunch of authors who are putting their rights in a pot and then licensing the rights out to people, there are a couple of obvious ways that you could solve the problem from a legal point of view. There are probably some creative ways that I haven't thought of, and I hope others think of, but two obvious ways. One is to, instead of licensing the rights to the project, actually sell the rights to the project. If you do that, then the project, whoever that is, then has the right to do enforcement, and the author, at least theoretically, doesn't have that right anymore. I don't know how many of you have ever contributed to a Free Software Foundation project, the GNU project, but they actually require an assignment of rights. And if you go back about 15 years, many projects actually thought about requiring an assignment of rights so that you actually sold your rights to the project. Not many projects use that anymore because there was a great deal of resistance to it. The initial reason for asking for an assignment of rights really wasn't about this issue at all. It was about the ability to do enforcement generally. It was thought that if there wasn't an assignment of rights, no one could do enforcement. Now people are more worried that if there isn't an assignment of rights, everyone can do enforcement, and that is extremely disruptive. So one possibility is to change the kinds of contribution models that open source projects are using. That would be a radical change for the kernel. I'm guessing it probably wouldn't fly at all. It means that contributors have to place a lot of trust in the project and how they're going to conduct enforcement. The project could not conduct enforcement at all, and contributors would be upset about that, or they could be too aggressive about enforcement, and they could be upset about that. And if you look at all of the discussion in open source forums and discussion groups and so forth, you'll see a lot of debate about the issue of how aggressive enforcement should be. There are camps that think no formal enforcement should be done at all. It should all be sort of community-based and compliance-oriented. And then there are people who think more enforcement should be done. And then there are, a couple of rogue enforcers who are just trying to get as much money as possible from people who are violating open source licenses. So there are opinions across the spectrum. And one of the problems with with an assignment model is going to be that you have to place trust in the project, and you might be concerned about changes in management of the project over time. So that's going to be one possibility. Another possibility is to keep the model the way it is, with the kind of throwing all the rights into the stew and then licensing them out side by side, but to have a separate contract with the project when you contribute, designating the project as your enforcer. And that ends up being a little bit similar to assignment, but it could be more nuanced because the terms of that agreement could be a little bit more flexible. And so I think one of the things that you might see in the future is that when you contribute to a project, you might be asked also to agree to an enforcement agreement. This is so that the projects can make sure that rogue enforcers are not out there disrupting their developer base. And of course, at the end, why should I care as a developer or a contributor? You might expect to see a possible sea change in the way contribution terms are done. The way they're done right now, it's been settled for a while. If you want to contribute to an open source project, if you're working for a big company, there are probably policies about what you can contribute to and under what terms, and your company has gotten comfortable with a lot of the contribution terms. If these get changed, that's going to start a whole new decision process in corporate America. For individual contributors, it's of course more of a personal decision, but it might be hard to understand what they're asking you to do. I hope that what I've said today will explain some of the reasons why you might see that, but I hope with my talk today you'll be armed for a possible discussion about this issue. And if a project presents you with terms saying, well, sure, you can contribute to this project under GPL, but you're going to have to separately make an agreement with us about the scope of enforcement, that will not be a complete surprise to you. As those models are developed, I'm sure there will be a lot of information and discussion about them. They're very much in the nascent stage right now, but the open source legal community really has to get on the stick and do something about this, or else we've got some possible issues down the road. License in, license out, while it's very popular today, may become less popular in favor of assignments of rights in order to address this issue. So if you see either of these things coming down the pike, you've been forewarned. I hope that the talk has been interesting and informative. I'll be around for questions after if you'd like to talk. And as you heard, I'm going to be doing a workshop on compliance, and anybody who has questions about this or compliance or any other open source licensing topic, please feel free to ask. I love to talk about questions. Thank you very much. You've been so attentive on a technical legal topic. My book is on Amazon, or if you want a PDF copy, just email me and I'll tell you how to get one. I pretty much give them away like candy. So they're cheap on Amazon and they're free if you can deal with the PDF. Thank you very much. Thank you very much to Linaro Connect for asking me to talk. It's a delight for me to talk about something that's a little bit more of an idea and a little less nuts and bolts, and I really appreciate it a lot.
Thank you so much.